Hi, my name is Bente, I'm the Norse Witch, and welcome to the fourth video in my series on the runes. This week we are talking about the second group of the runes, the second Aett. But before we start out, as always, a little Patron shoutout. Thank you very much to Eli Brackett, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Andrew, Bran, Jenny, Tyler, Thomas, Els, Maggie, Betty, Misty, Athena, Cameron, Ines, Tiffany, Amy, Rhiannon, Dario, Colette, Soren, Braden, Bethany, Tell, Timothy, Coffee, the honorary gossip squirrel, Bjorn, Scylla, Ash, Lucy, and Joss. They're getting so many. And now let's hop into the video. Let's talk about the runes. So as I already said, this is a series on the runes. So if you are new here, welcome. I would suggest you watch the other videos, the previous videos in this series first, because in this video we are solely focusing on the second Aett, so the runes Hagalaz to Sowilo. In the previous videos I have covered topics like what the runes are in general, the history and origin of the runes, and in the last video, of course, I covered the meanings of the first 8 runes, and now we're up to the second group. Before we start out though, I want to give a little book recommendation. I already had book recommendations in I think the first video, but I got a new book on the runes and I think it's pretty good. I haven't read this book all the way through yet, but I've worked with some of the meanings from this book for the last video and this video also, because, well, first of all, it's Taking Up the Runes by Diana Paxson, and she does a pretty good summary on what other authors have written on the runes. So if you don't really want to work through several books, there are a lot of meanings already in this book, because as I said, she does a little summary on what other authors have written. I think it's pretty good. Also, she has all the rune poems included. That I think is really important and that's missing in a lot of books. So I would suggest this book now. This video, of course, is on the second group of the runes, the second Aett. And again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. It deals with topics like transformation, initiation, pain, struggles, changes, but also hope and protection, to name some positive influences in this Aett, because it can be kind of negative in a lot of ways. So let's hop right into the rune Hagalaz. Hagalaz, the translation for Hagalaz is hail. So it's already not up to the best start. But let's see what the rune poems say about Hagalaz. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says, "Hail is the whitest of grain, it is whirled from heaven's loft, tossed about by wind's gusts, then melts into water." The Icelandic rune poem says, "Hail is cold grain and driving sleet and sickness of serpents." And lastly, the Norwegian rune poem says, "Hail is the coldest of grains, Christ created the primeval world." So we see general themes here of destruction, renewal, change and transformation. But it's not just blind destruction for the sake of destruction. It's destruction that was needed to create something new or something better. So if you think, for example, of hail, of course it will destroy your crops. So of course it's something negative at first, but the hail on the ground, it will melt to water and it will water the crops. So in the end, it will bring increased fertility too. So while yes, Hagalaz is a very disruptive and destructive force, it's usually some kind of disruption or destruction that leads to a new beginning, new fertility, new growth. So it's not as negative, I would say personally, as Thurisaz, and it's, in my experience, usually the disruption and the destruction that can come with Hagalaz is not as heavy as it is with Thurisaz. And then lastly, Hagalaz is often associated with the goddess Hel. Next we have the rune Naudhiz. The translation for the rune Naudhiz is need. So again, not really that positive. Let's say what the rune poems have to say about Naudhiz. The Norwegian rune poem says about Naudhiz, "Need leaves little choice, the naked man is chilled by frost." Next we have the Icelandic rune poem which says, "Need is distress of thrall woman, and state of oppression and hard work." And lastly, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, "Need is nearest to the breast, yet often proves to children of men a source of help and healing, or omen of good, if they heed it betimes. So we see we have two rune poems, both the Norwegian and the Icelandic rune poem, that are pretty negative all the way through. But in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, we see that there's actually also a positive to Naudhiz, because it says, yet often proves to children of men a source of help and healing. So it can also be positive. Naudhiz is associated with topics like need, of course, necessity, fate, and vird, of course. It's kind of like you are getting dealt some kind of negative card by fate. You're getting dealt something negative, something that leads you in a state of maybe helplessness. You need something, either you maybe you need money or you need help from someone. Something that has happened to you leads to you being in need. So of course, Naudhiz symbolizes the state of need, but it also symbolizes how we deal with it, like how we react to it. And that is where the Anglo-Saxon rune poem says that it can be something positive, because if you are being dealt something negative by fate, then you can learn from it, you can grow from it, you can make something positive from it. It's kind of like if the universe gives you lemons, make lemonade from it. I don't know if that's exactly how it's said, but you know what I mean. So yes, Naudhiz definitely symbolizes a challenging time, but it's also a chance for learning and for growing. So it's not necessarily extremely negative, it really depends on how you react to it. So Naudhiz is also associated with the way that we try to change our own fate. Those are all things that are associated with Naudhiz. So I would say personally, there are no gods really associated with Naudhiz, but I associate them very heavily with the Norns. Then next up, we have the rune Isa. Isa, the translation for the name Isa is ice. Let us see again what the rune poems have to say about Isa. First up, we have the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, which says, ice be over cold, unmeasurably slippery, glisteneth clear as glass to gems likest, a floor by frost wrought, fair to be seen. Then we have the Norwegian rune poem, which says, ice we call the broad bridge, the blind man must be led. And then lastly, the Icelandic rune poem. Ice is bark of rivers and roof of the wave, and destruction for doomed men. So again, a kind of negative rune. We have a lot of associations with it being kind of pretty, but treacherous, because if you step on the ice, you can break into the ice or you can slip on it. The rune Isa symbolizes things as ice, well, of course, but with that also come stillness, inertia, and just a general lack of movement, action, and vibration. It can mean that a situation is stuck, that there's a lack of action. So if you are getting Isa as a rune, for example, in a reading, it means that something is not moving. So either you are kind of paralyzed by something, you don't dare to move, you don't know what to do, so you're kind of stuck. That is the influence of Isa. It can also be used though for positive things. So for example, if you want to do, well, of course, a freezer spell, for example, Isa is perfect. Isa is an energy that can freeze other people and situations. If something is getting too much for you, you can use Isa to kind of counteract that. If a person is treating you badly and you want them to stop, you can freeze them with Isa. You just have to be aware of the fact that Isa is ice. So ice melts at some point, so at some point you will have to release that. But like that, of course, also attacks can be counteracted, hexes, curses, jinxes can be counteracted. It's pretty good for that stuff. So the thing with Isa for me that is really important is Isa can be good and it can be bad. It depends on the balance. Too much Isa, definitely bad, because you are freezing something. There's no vibration, no movement. Too little Isa can have the effect of being overwhelmed by too much action, too much going on. And lastly, because of this treacherous, tricky characteristic of Isa, it can be used as a form of protection. Because if you think of it, if you surround yourself with something that looks beautiful to the outside, but will kind of hit you in the face if you step on it or touch it or do something with it, it makes for a pretty good return to sender or kind of counter-action protection spell, I think. Then next up we have Jera, which means year, and this is where it's all getting a bit more positive again. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says about Jera, summer is called joyful when God lets holy heaven's king shining fruits be born from earth for rich and poor. Next up we have the Icelandic rune poem, which says, harvest is a blessing to men and good summer and fully ripe crops. And the Norwegian rune poem, says, "Harvest is a blessing to men. I say that Frodi was liberal." So yeah, what we see here about Jera is, of course, the year in general, but especially summer and the harvest period. Harvests, seasonal changes, natural cycles and cyclical patterns are all incorporated in Jera. So yeah, this is kind of a contrasting rune to Isa. If we think about it, Isa is kind of winter, it's ice, it's cold and lack of movement. And then we have Jera, which is summer and the harvesting period. It's blissful, it's the bountiful summer, and it's a prosperous time for everyone. Harvest is of course a key point to this rune. It's kind of the important topic for this rune. But we can see it in a little broader sense. It's not only actually harvesting grains or something, but if you think about it, harvest is the reward that you reap after the efforts that you have put into something. So if you work on something for a long time, at some point you will reap the rewards of that, and that is Jera. But as I said, also topics like the natural cycles, the seasonal changes, like kind of the turn of the wheel of the year are also all patterns of Jera. And if we think about the cyclical patterns, it's not just, for example, the path of the earth around the sun, it's also our own cyclical patterns. So if you think about it, everyone has their own cyclical patterns, and these are also symbolized by Jera. Lastly, Jera, because of its associations with harvest and the harvesting period and everything like that, it is associated with the god Freyr. Then next up from Jera we come to Eihwaz, and Nike is here to join us. And the translation for Eihwaz is the yew tree. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says the following about Eihwaz. "The yew outside is a rough-barked tree, both strong and firm, guard of fires, by deep roots upheld, joy to the home." The Norwegian rune poem says, "Yew is the greenest of trees in winter, when it burns it sputters." And the Icelandic rune poem says, "Yew is bent bow and brittle iron, and farbauti, a giant, of the arrow." It's pretty interesting here that the Icelandic rune poem is the only poem that talks about the yew tree only as a hunting bow. And that's probably because in Iceland there are no yew trees. Yew trees don't grow in Iceland. So probably the only way the Icelanders came in contact with yew trees were because they were buying hunting bows made from yew. All authors whose books I have read have agreed on the fact that Eihwaz probably symbolizes Yggdrasil, the world tree. So of course it symbolizes Yggdrasil in general, but also everything that Yggdrasil stands for. For example, it has ties to the underworld and the dead. It's an extremely mystical rune in general that's kind of hard to grasp. Eihwaz, because it symbolizes Yggdrasil, also symbolizes traveling the 9 worlds, because usually if you want to do that, you kind of travel along Yggdrasil and its branches. So that is something that I also very, very closely associate with Eihwaz. Along with that, of course, also comes sending messages between these 9 worlds. But Yggdrasil, as being a world tree, of course, it kind of connects heaven and earth, like the upper world and the lower world and the middle world. It connects all the worlds together. It connects opposites and paradoxes. So that's also something that Eihwaz symbolizes. And lastly, as we have seen in the Icelandic rune poem, of course, it has also ties to hunting. This meaning of hunting hasn't really come up in readings for me personally yet, when Eihwaz came up in readings for me or for other people that I have done rune readings for, but who knows? I personally don't really work with it that much, but of course I understand if other people do it, if it's literally said that in the Icelandic rune poem. And from one mystical, kind of hard to grasp rune, we come to probably the most mystical, hard to grasp rune, which is Perthro. Perthro is definitely the rune we know the least about, and we already see that because of its name, because nobody really knows for sure what this name means. Translations that I usually went with are lot, cup, or game piece. But let's see what the rune poems have to say about Perthro. Well, Perthro actually only exists in the Anglo-Saxon Futhark and not in the younger Futhark, so we only have the Anglo-Saxon rune poem to go off of. But what does it say? The chess, or the gaming piece, means play and laughter, where in the middle the warriors sit in beer hall blithely together. There are warriors, they're sitting together, and they're playing a game and having a good time. Of course, from this one rune poem we don't really get that much info, That's also why I said we don't really have that much information on Perthro, but some meanings that are usually derived from that rune poem are that Perthro symbolizes things like gambling, divination, chance, random factors, and risks. The gambling part is of course very obvious because it is literally written in the rune poem. But if you think about it, gambling is always about taking risks and kind of about random factors because you don't know what you will get and you just hope for the best. And the cup from which dice are thrown, that's usually what Perthro is supposed to depict as kind of a cup lying on its side, kind of. And this cup that is used to throw dice could also be used to throw runes or to cast runes. So that is where this divination meaning is coming from. And it also kind of makes sense because if you think about it, if you are gambling, you are kind of playing with your fate. You don't know what you will get. So gambling kind of shows your personal fate. And that is exactly what divination does too. So these two kind of go hand in hand. But one meaning that I have also read and that also kind of rings true with me because in my experience when casting runes, when Perthro comes up, a lot of the times it kind of means there is a mystery and you aren't supposed to know that yet. So if you are asking a question and you're getting Perthro, the rune, as an answer, it usually means you aren't really supposed to know. Or you could do some divination on that. But it's never really a straight up answer. And from one rune we don't really know a lot of, we come to another rune we kind of know more of, but also not really, because it's also only in one rune poem, it's also only in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, and that is Algiz or Elhaz. I will go into the translations of this later, because there are more than one translation that's possible for this rune, and more than one name actually. But as always, what does the Anglo-Saxon rune poem say about Algiz or Elhaz? In the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, it's actually called Eol. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's kind of translated as eelgrass or elk sedge. So it says, elk sedge or eelgrass is found mostly in fens, waxes in water, wounds grimly, with blood burns whatever warrior that goes to grasp it. So it's a kind of grass that grows in the water, and if you touch it or if you try to grab it, it will give you some kind of paper cuts and it burns, it's painful, and ouch. So let us now get into the translations, because the possible names of this rune are kind of confusing, and then of course the translations too. So the Old Germanic name for the rune is Elhaz, which means elk. So of course one translation, one obvious translation would be elk. But in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, it's the name of it is Eol or something. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there it means elk sedge or eelgrass, so kind of has to do with an elk, but it's a kind of grass that cuts your hand. So not really the same thing. But then if we think of the Latin name for the European elk is Alcis alcis, which is interesting because the word Algiz is also mentioned in Tacitus Germania, where it means something like a sacred grove or divinity in general. And that is where we can go even further, because Grimm favors this translation and the symbolization of sacred groves and divinity. And he actually says that there are a lot of instances where the Old Germanic word Allah is used, and it also refers to temples or sanctuaries. And then lastly, we have another possible name for the rune, which is Algiz. That is probably the one that I see most commonly, and this means swan. So we have a lot of different names and a lot of different translations, but only one rune poem. So we see with all of these different names and all of these different translations, of course, there are a lot of different possible meanings of this rune. One thing that most people agree on, though, is that it stands for protection, because it makes sense for most of the names. And also like for the main names, both the name in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem makes sense with protection, because if the grass cuts you, if you grab it, it's kind of protecting itself from being ripped out of the ground. And the elk also makes sense with protection. But of course with the name Algiz, if we go by that, which means swan, it definitely has ties to the Valkyries. And then also we have the symbolization of divinity. I have seen this one go pretty far as to say that the rune is supposed to resemble a human that looks at the sky like this and is kind of praying to divinity. Possible, but yeah, you have to kind of see with which name and which meaning you go with. I tend to just go with protection, because that is what makes most sense to me with all the different names and meanings. But then lastly, hallelujah, we come to a rune that is easier to understand, which is Sowilo, and this translates to sun. Luckily, this rune is also included in all of the rune poems, so let us see what they have to say. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says, "Sun to seamen is a hope on high when they ferry over the fish's bath until the seahorse brings them to land." Then we have the Icelandic rune poem, which says, "Sun is shield of the sky and shining ray and destroyer of the ice." And lastly, the Norwegian rune poem says, "Sun is the light of the lands, I bow to heaven's doom." So this is probably pretty easy to interpret because I feel like the sun back then seemed to kind of mean the same things as it does to us. It's a lot about hope, guidance, positivity, success, and luck. It's a very positive thing. I mean, if you only think about Vikings maybe who were on their ships on the sea, they don't see any land. They used the sun to know where they're going. There is a very, very, very big association with hope and guidance. What I find pretty interesting is the mention in the Icelandic rune poem and destroyer of the ice, because we know ice, we have seen already, it's Isa. So it kind of seems like Sowilo is kind of a counter force to Isa. It can kind of melt Isa. Sowilo in general, it's just a very, very positive rune. It's a rune that symbolizes success and luck. It's, yeah, whenever it comes up in a reading, it symbolizes positive things and it can brighten up the whole reading. I think there was not a single reading that I have done where Sowilo symbolized anything negative. I think it was always positive when I got it. And it's also, as a counter force to Isa, it's also a very active kind of energy, where Isa is very passive because it's a lack of action, lack of vibration. Sowilo is really active. It's going forward and actively doing shit. So yeah, this was the second Aett. I really, really hope that it was insightful, especially because it was quite a lot of work to go through all the meanings and all the rune poems and put everything together and kind of understand all the stuff with Algiz or Elhaz. It was very confusing to me. So, of course, I really, really hope that this video helped. Again, this is a video in a series, so if you haven't watched the other videos in the series yet, then go watch those. Of course, in the next video we will talk about the last runes in the Elder Futhark and their meanings, and then we will go into all the topics, what you can do with the runes, how to do divination with the runes, how to make bind runes, for example, whatever. Everything that you can do with the runes we will talk about in later videos. So if you want to watch those videos too, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss them, and give a thumbs up. And of course, check out my Instagram and TikTok, and of course my shop. There's always stuff with runes in my shop, and maybe even consider becoming my patron. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!